I was the deadliest blade in the Alpha Legion, a warrior whose shadow made kings tremble. But I carried a secret that would get me executed if the scent ever leaked. My greatest rival, the man who spent years trying to break my spirit, trapped me in a frozen cavern where my suppressants finally ran out. In the pitch black, my body betrayed my pride, and the enemy I hated became the only person I could ever belong to.
Welcome to another Bliss Tales video. Subscribe to my channel to keep these beautiful tales alive. New info, we have memberships and supers now where you can thank me and suggest new video ideas. Thanks for your support.
This story didn't start in a cave. It didn't start with a heat cycle or a collapsed mountain or 90 days of silence and survival. It started the way all terrible, beautiful things start. Quietly. In the ordinary moments nobody thinks to remember until everything after them is ruined. It started with a morning. Just a morning. Cold, gray. The kind where frost climbs the inside of the barack windows and your breath fogs the air before you even leave your bunk. I remember pulling on my wrappings before anyone else woke. That was always the ritual. Before the others. Before the noise. Before anyone could accidentally brush past me in the narrow corridor and notice that I smelled wrong, or that my frame, beneath all that armor, didn't quite fill it the way theirs did. 7 years I'd been doing that. 7 years of waking up an hour before the rest of the Alpha Legion just to make sure the mask was on before anyone could see the face underneath. The herbs were bitter. They always were. Ground moonbark and saltroot, pressed into a paste I rubbed along my collarbone and the backs of my wrists. Places where the scent glands sit. Places where an omega's chemistry bleeds through most. I'd memorized every pressure point on my own body the way other warriors memorized weak spots on their enemies. Same principle. Different war. Most people don't know what it's like to be at war with your own biology every single day. To wake up and immediately start managing something inside you that wants desperately to be known. Your body has its own language. It speaks whether you tell it to or not. My whole life had been about muffling that language. Distorting it. Translating it into something the world around me would accept. The Alpha Legion didn't accept omegas. That's too soft a way to say it. The Alpha Legion executed omegas. Quietly, efficiently, the way they did most things. Because the logic, if you could call it that, was simple. An omega in a combat unit was a vulnerability. A scent in the wrong moment could destabilize an entire battalion. Could turn alphas feral mid-battle. Could compromise a mission. Could get people killed. I understood the logic. I even agreed with it in a detached, surgical way that I developed to survive. I just didn't agree that I was the vulnerability they were imagining. Because I was ranked second in the entire Legion. Second out of 400 warriors. I had 17 confirmed kills in field operations. I had pulled 3 of my unit members out of ambushes that should have been mass graves. I had endured training regimens that broke men twice my size. Not because I was physically stronger, because I wasn't, but because I was smarter, faster, and I had been running on empty for so long that suffering had just become my resting state. Second rank. There was only one person above me. Jaxen. I need you to understand something about Jaxen before I go further. Because the easy version of this story would make him simple. The brutal alpha. The arrogant rival. The man who existed just to oppose me. That would be clean. That would make sense. But Jaxen wasn't simple. That was the problem with him. That was always the problem. He was the kind of man who moved through a room and the room reorganized itself around him without his permission. Not because he demanded it. He didn't demand things. He didn't have to. He had this quality, this stillness under pressure, that made everyone around him feel like they were running while he was walking. Like he had already seen 3 moves ahead and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. He was magnificent. And I hated him so deeply for it that sometimes I'd lie awake at night running through every one of his flaws just to balance the scale in my head. He was arrogant. He assumed competence from everyone around him and showed visible contempt when they failed to deliver it. He didn't soften criticism. He didn't mentor. He simply evaluated, found you wanting or adequate, and moved on. He had no patience for excuses and even less for sentiment. He trained alone half the time because group training, in his words, was just organized mediocrity. And he hated me, not the casual dismissal he gave everyone else. He actually hated me. There was heat in it. Specific, intentional heat. He watched me in a way that made my skin feel too tight, like his attention was something I had to armor against. He challenged my rankings. He called my methods unconventional in debriefs in the tone of voice that means wrong. He requested I be reassigned to scouting units 3 separate times, and 3 separate times Commander Drail denied him because my results spoke for themselves. I used to think he hated me because he wanted to be uncontested, because second place existing offended him. I know now that wasn't it. He hated me because he couldn't figure me out. And Jaxen was not a man accustomed to things he couldn't figure out. He would walk past me in the corridor sometimes and just stop and breathe. Slow, measured, like he was tasting the air. And then something would cross his face, confusion or frustration or something I couldn't name, and he would walk on without saying a word. The moonbark wasn't perfect. I knew that. I had always known that. It masked the primary markers, the sweetness that Omega scent is known for, but something beneath it, something underneath the chemistry, couldn't be fully erased. Jaxen had the most refined instincts in the Legion. Everyone said so. He could track prey across stone. He could tell which direction a group of men had fled based purely on trace scent in the wind. He knew something was wrong with me. He just couldn't name it. That was the knife I lived with every single day. Not the fear of discovery. The fear of the almost discovery. The moment right before the truth lands that stretches out forever. 6 months before the cave, he cornered me after a sparring session. I had beaten him. Not easily. It had taken everything I had and a move I'd been developing for 2 years. A feint built around reading the microtension in an opponent's dominant shoulder before they commit to a strike. I hit the ground hard after he countered my last sequence, and I lay there staring at the gray ceiling of the training hall, breathing through my teeth, while the other warriors drifted out and left us alone. He stood over me, not threatening, just there. He said, "You fight like you're afraid." I said, "I fight like I win." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Those aren't the same thing." He walked away, and I stayed on that floor longer than I needed to because my legs felt like water and I couldn't stop turning his words over in my head. He was right. He was right, and that infuriated me more than anything he could have done. Because I did fight afraid. Every single day. The fear wasn't of him. It wasn't of losing. It was the deep constant fear of being seen. Of the mask slipping. Of all of it, the 7 years and the bitter herbs and the hour before dawn, collapsing in a single moment of exposure. That fear had made me exceptional. It had pushed me further than almost anyone in the Legion could reach. But Jaxen saw it. He saw the fear underneath the excellence, and he didn't know what to do with that any more than I knew what to do with him seeing it. The mission came 2 weeks later. Northern Mountain Range, near the border territories. A supply route needed clearing. 3 hostile units reported in the area. Standard extraction objective: get in, neutralize the threat to the route, confirm the path was clean, get out. Commander Drail wanted his 2 best warriors leading the advance team. So it was me and Jaxen and 6 others. We barely spoke on the march up. The air was thin and cold and the mountain path was narrow, and I kept my distance from him the way I always did. Far enough that his instincts couldn't get a clean read on me. Close enough that I could monitor him because monitoring Jaxen had become its own kind of survival habit. The mission went fine for 2 days. On the 3rd day, the mountain decided it was done with us. I don't know what caused the landslide. Probably the explosives the hostile unit had rigged along the ridge. We'd taken out 2 of their 3 positions, and I think they triggered a collapse to cut off our retreat. I don't know. One moment the ground was solid and the next the world was noise and weight and the breath knocked clean out of my body. When I opened my eyes I was in darkness. Complete, absolute darkness. The kind that has texture. The kind you feel pressing against your eyes. I couldn't hear the others. I could hear something that might have been wind or might have been my own blood. I could feel stone beneath my hands, irregular and cold. My left shoulder was screaming. My supply pack was still on my back, which was either luck or the cruelest joke the universe had ever told me. Then a voice. Close. Low. Controlled in the specific way that means the person controlling it is working very hard to do so. Can you move? Not a question. Jaxen didn't ask questions when the answer would waste time. He assessed. And he was close enough that I could hear him without him raising his voice. Yes, I said. We found each other in the dark by sound. By the scrape of movement against stone. I felt his hand find my arm before I saw anything, and the grip was too tight and then immediately not tight enough, like he had adjusted the pressure the moment he realized he'd applied too much. He had a small lumenstone in his pack. The pale blue glow it cast made the cave look like the inside of a nightmare. Stone walls close on every side. A narrow passage to our left that went somewhere. A wall of rubble behind us that was absolutely nowhere. Just us. Just the two of us, and however far down this cave system went, and the contents of our packs and the cold that was already settling into the stone around us. I took stock. My suppressants. I counted the vials. 12 days of doses, maybe 14 if I stretched them. My herbs were mostly intact. Food for 2 weeks if we rationed hard. Water was the question. There was no water source visible yet. Jaxen watched me take stock. He said nothing. He did his own inventory in that parallel, efficient way he had, like we were running the same program in different machines. Then he looked at the passage to our left and said, "That goes somewhere. Could go deeper into the mountain," I said. "Could go out. Could collapse." He looked at me. The lumenstone cast his face in pale blue and shadow, and he looked, for just a moment, like something inhuman. Something old. He said, "Did you expect to die today?" I said, "Not specifically." He almost smiled. I had never seen Jaxen almost smile before. It was alarming. The first week was bearable. That's the only word for it. Bearable. We explored the passage and found it opened into a larger geothermal cave system. Warm stone, mineral smell, and no exit. But at the far end of the second chamber there was a seep in the rock wall. A thin trickle of water that tasted like the earth but was clean enough. We rationed everything. We slept in shifts. We didn't talk much. What we did do, inevitably, was exist in close proximity. You can't help it in a cave. There's no corner to disappear into. There's no door to put between yourself and another person. We slept on opposite ends of the chamber, but the chamber wasn't large. And when Jaxen's breathing shifted at night, I knew it. When I had nightmares, which I did twice, he was awake before I'd fully surfaced from them. He never asked about them. That was almost worse. On day 9 he said, "You don't smell right." Just like that. No preamble. We were eating in the quiet and he said it like he'd been running the observation through his head and finally decided the holding cost was too high. I said, "I know." He said, "What are you putting on yourself?" I said, "Medicine." He looked at me for so long that I had time to build a complete contingency response in my head for every direction this could go. Then he said, "Are you sick?" And the answer to that was complicated. Not yes and not no. I was managing. I said, "I'm managing." He let it go. He shouldn't have. He should have pushed. But he let it go and went back to his portion of the rations, and I sat with the weight of my 12 remaining doses and I did the math. 12 days. We had been in the cave 9 days. If help came before I ran out, I was fine. If it didn't, I stopped doing the math. Day 12 I woke up wrong. I knew immediately. There is no good way to describe the specific sensation of your body beginning to override its own suppression. It's like something deep in the architecture of you starts warming up. Turns on. Comes online in ways it's been offline for so long that the activation itself is alien. I used my last dose and lay there in the dark with my heart going too fast and told myself it would hold. Told myself we'd be out in 2 days. Someone would dig through. The Legion didn't abandon ranked warriors. They'd come. Day 14. I was burning. Heat fever, the technical term for an omega in an unsuppressed cycle who has no outlet, no relief, is kind of like saying drowning is technically just water entering the lungs. Accurate. Insufficient. The fever builds in your joints first, then your chest. Your thoughts come apart at the edges. You stop being able to track time precisely. Everything is texture and pressure and the unbearable fact of your own body. I know Jaxen knew. I know he knew the moment the last of the moon bark metabolized because his behavior changed. He stopped being still. He started moving around the edges of the chamber in a way that was almost like pacing. His breathing changed. And his eyes, when they found me, had something in them I had never seen there before. Not contempt. Not hatred. Something older. Something he was fighting. I said, "Don't." He said, "I'm not doing anything." I said, "You're about to. Don't." He crouched down across from me and the lumenstone between us made his face very clear and he looked like a man in a war with himself and losing. He said, "How long have you been hiding this?" I said, 7 years. He closed his eyes, just briefly. Then he said, "How bad is it?" I said, "If we were outside I'd find a way to manage. But we're not outside." No. There was a long silence. The longest one yet. The kind that has its own weight, its own specific gravity. Then he said very quietly, "I won't hurt you." And something about the way he said it. The simplicity of it. Not a promise with terms. Not a negotiation. Just a fact he was offering me like you offer water to someone who's been in the dark too long. I said, "I know. What happened next? I'm not going to dress it up in ways that make it easier to digest." It was not romantic in the clean story sense. It was not two enemies discovering soft feelings in a dramatic moonlit moment. It was two people in a cave with no options and bodies that had very specific needs and a decision that we made together with our eyes open, knowing full well what it would cost us. It was survival. It was also, somehow, the most honest thing that had ever happened to me. Because when there are no walls left, when the masks are all gone and the armor is off and there is literally no performance possible, what's left is just you. The actual you. Jaxen and I made it through the worst of the fever and he didn't flinch from any of it. He was methodical and careful and occasionally infuriating in the way that only he could be, giving quiet directives like we were running a field operation, and somewhere in the middle of all of it I started laughing. Actually laughing, which surprised us both. He said, "What?" I said, "You're treating this like a tactical problem." He said, "All problems have solutions." I laughed again and felt the fever ease slightly and his arm was around me and neither of us moved away. In the days after, something had shifted. You can't go back to the pattern you had before something like that. The circuitry is rewired. We still didn't talk much, but the silence changed. It stopped being hostile and became something else. Something that had more oxygen in it. He started sleeping closer. Not touching, just closer. Within arm's reach. And when I woke from nightmares he would say my name once, quietly, and I would surface and know where I was. A month in. The rations were dangerously low. We were supplementing with what the geothermal cave produced. Some fungal growth along the walls that was edible in small amounts, mineral-rich water from the seep. We were both lean and tired and the lumenstone was losing its charge. I started feeling wrong again. But differently. Not heat. Something else. Something new. In the mornings I would wake up nauseous. The fungal growth smell, which had been neutral, became unbearable. Certain positions when I slept made me dizzy when I stood. My appetite was strange, intense and then entirely absent with no pattern. Jaxen noticed before I acknowledged it. Because of course he did. He noticed everything. He just didn't say it until I did. I figured it out on day 47. And then I sat with it for 3 days before I said anything because I needed those 3 days. I needed them to cycle through every version of what this meant. For my position in the Legion. For my life. For this person across the cave from me who had spent years as my enemy and was now, somehow, the only person in the world who knew what I really was. On day 50 I told him. He went very still. That specific Jaxen stillness that meant the computation running behind his eyes was intense and private and not yet complete. Then he got up and came and sat next to me and looked at the cave wall and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Okay." I said, "Okay." He said, "What do you need?" I said, "I don't know yet." He said, "Then we figure it out." That was it. That was the whole conversation. And somehow it was enough. Because it was Jaxen, and Jaxen didn't offer comfort in the ways you'd expect. He offered logistics. He offered presence. He changed how he allocated the rations without explaining why. He started sleeping closer again. He found a second water seep I had missed, 10 meters deeper in the chamber, cleaner than the first. He said I had probably smelled it before he found it, that he had noticed me orienting toward that wall in my sleep. And Omega's instincts, even suppressed, even trained out, even armored over with 7 years of discipline and bitter herbs. Still there. Still useful. Still mine. I thought about that a lot in the long quiet hours. The world outside thought Omega instincts were vulnerabilities. Olfactory oversensitivity. Hormonal variability. The capacity for bonding that could compromise tactical decision-making. Everything they listed as weakness. In the cave, every single one of those things kept us alive. I found the water source. My body knew something was wrong with the fungal growth long before we could see spoilage with our eyes, and I stopped eating it 3 days before Jaxen did, and he spent a miserable 24 hours sick and I didn't. My sleep, even disrupted, even anxious, was patterned in a way that kept me alert during the periods Jaxen needed deep rest. We worked in a rhythm that I don't think either of us designed. It just emerged. 90 days. Give or take. Time moves strangely in the dark. On the 90th day I heard it. A sound from the direction of the original collapse. Distant. Rhythmic. The sound of tools against stone. I told Jaxen before I was certain. He listened, head tilted, and then he heard it too, and something in his face did something I still don't have a word for. We didn't celebrate. We just sat together for a moment in the fading lumenstone light and breathed the same air and didn't say anything, and I think that was the right choice. Words would have been too small. When the wall came down and the light poured in and the rescue team found us, I saw their faces and I knew what they were seeing. Jaxen standing. Me beside him. The changes in my body that 90 days hadn't hidden and wouldn't hide now. The questions started immediately. They took us back to the main camp under what they called protective escort, and I called something closer to custody. Commander Drail met us at the gate. He looked at me for a long time. He looked at Jaxen. He looked at me again. He said, "We'll deal with this inside." The tribunal was 3 days later. I was given quarters, not a cell, but with a guard on the door that made the distinction mostly symbolic. Jaxen was debriefed separately. I don't know what he said in those sessions. I wasn't allowed to ask. At the tribunal, the clan leader, a man named Vorith who had held his position for 20 years through a combination of genuine ferocity and practiced ruthlessness, looked at me the way you look at a problem you've already decided the solution to. He said the thing I had always known was coming. That I had infiltrated the Alpha Legion under false identity. That my presence had compromised the bloodline integrity of the clan's elite unit. That the penalty for this was death, and that the only question was whether I would be executed publicly, as a warning, or privately as a mercy. He asked if I had anything to say. I said no, because I had prepared for this. I had prepared for this for 7 years, and I was too tired and too changed to perform the speech I'd once imagined giving. Jaxen stood up. He had been seated to my right, and I had been aware of him there the whole time, a still point in my peripheral vision, and I had told myself he was going to let this happen because the alternative was him standing with an Omega, and that was its own kind of death in this legion. He stood up. He didn't look at Vorith immediately. He looked at me first. Just for a moment. The look that said the calculation was already done and the answer was already settled. Then he looked at the clan leader and he said, "He found the water." Silence. He said, 90 days in a geothermal system with no visible water source. I would have been dead in 3 weeks. He scented a seep 10 meters deep in the cave wall that I couldn't locate by any other means. Without that, The conversation we're having now doesn't happen because I'm not alive to have it. He paused. The quality you're calling a vulnerability kept your highest-ranked warrior breathing for 3 months. Vorith said, "The law," Jaxen said, "the law was written for battle conditions. For the specific scenario of an Omega in an active unit compromising a live engagement. There is no precedent for this. And if you execute a warrior with 17 confirmed kills and a survival record that speaks for itself, over a category that your own law didn't design for this situation, you will be managing the politics of that decision for the next decade." Vorith looked at him with the specific expression of a man recalibrating. Jaxen said, "He is not an infiltrator. He is the outcome of a system that told the people best suited to survive that they weren't allowed to try. And the only thing his survival proves is that the system is wrong." More silence. "The heavy kind," Jaxen said. "He carries my heir. You execute him, you execute your next commander's child. I'm comfortable with however you want to respond to that information publicly. It wasn't a threat. It was just a fact. Delivered in the quiet, level tone Jaxen used for everything. 3 moves ahead and already waiting. Vorith made his decision in stages. You could see it happen. The political calculation first. Then maybe something underneath that. I would be permitted to remain under a status that the clan had never used before and would have to invent. Not Alpha. Not the hidden Omega I had been. Something new. Something that didn't fit the existing architecture. Jaxen sat back down. He didn't look at me. I looked at him. There is a specific quality to the moment when a person does the irrevocable thing for you. The thing that costs them in ways you can't fully measure. He had not simply defended me. He had stood up in front of the entire command structure of the only world he had ever inhabited and told them they were wrong. Told them the category they had built their power on was insufficient. That the thing they called weakness had been, in fact, the quiet engine of their survival. He was too controlled to have visibly trembled. But I knew Jaxen now, in ways that came from 90 days of shared darkness. And I could see the cost of it in the set of his jaw and the particular stillness of his hands. In the weeks after, things were strange. The clan didn't know how to hold what had happened. There were warriors who avoided me with a specific hostility that felt like ideology. There were others who were curious in ways they didn't know how to express and so expressed nothing. There was a young recruit, barely 17, who came to my quarters one evening and stood in the doorway and asked, in a voice he was working very hard to keep steady, whether it was true that I had held a rank higher than most alphas in the unit. I said yes. He said, "How?" I said, "By being afraid of the right things." He thought about that. Then he left. He came back 2 days later and asked if I would teach him the shoulder read feint. I said yes to that too. Jaxen came in the evenings sometimes. Not always. He never made it a pattern that could be observed and named by people who would make it political. But he came. He would sit across from me and we would talk or not talk with equal comfort, and occasionally, he would rest one hand on my stomach with the matter-of-fact tenderness of a man who had decided something irrevocable and was not going to perform his feelings about it for anyone. I thought about identity a lot in those quiet evenings. About what it costs to perform yourself into something smaller than you are. About the 7 years of bitter herbs and pre-dawn rituals. About all the things I had been capable of, the instincts and capacities I had carefully buried under layers of armor, that had turned out to be not weakness but information. Not liability but a different kind of intelligence. The cave had taken everything from me. The suppressants, the mask, the carefully maintained fiction I had worn for 7 years. It had taken all of it and left me with nothing but the actual truth of what I was. And what I was had kept us alive. There's something unbearable about that kind of realization when you come to it. Because it asks you to grieve. To acknowledge the cost of all the hiding. To sit with the question of who you might have been if the world had been different. If the system had been built for something closer to the truth. I didn't have an answer for that. I'm not sure there is one. What I had was the evenings. The hand on my stomach. The man across from me who had once spent years trying to break my spirit and had chosen, in the end, to build something with me instead. The knowledge that somewhere beneath a mountain there was a thin seep of water running through dark stone that I had found because of what I am, not in spite of it. And a choice, still sitting in front of me like an unsheathed blade. Surrender the sword, or burn it all down and build something new from the ash. I looked at my hands one evening, the calluses, the scars, the evidence of 7 years of disciplined fury, and I thought about the child, about what world I was making for them, about whether this one could be changed or whether change required the kind of destruction that leaves nothing behind but the opportunity to try differently. Jaxen said, "You're planning something." I said, "I'm always planning something." He said, "Don't do it alone." I looked at him. He was watching me with that clear, evaluative gaze that had once felt like hostility and now felt like the most specific kind of attention I had ever been on the receiving end of. Seeing me, all of me, the thing under the thing under the thing. I said, "This isn't your fight." He said, "You've been my fight for 6 years. I just didn't know the terms." Outside the window the clan was moving. Training sounds, voices, the ordinary noise of a world that still mostly believed its own architecture. A world that had not yet decided what to do with the fact that one of its deadliest weapons had been hiding something that refused, in the end, to stay hidden. I pressed my hand over his on my stomach. I said, "Then we do it together." He said, "Together." The word sat between us the way all the important things had in the cave. Without ceremony, without decoration. Just the weight of the thing itself and the two of us choosing to hold it. The sword was still mine. I hadn't surrendered it. And I wasn't going to burn the Legion down. Not yet. Not unless I had to. But I was going to make them make room for the truth. Make room for the warriors the system had spent decades telling they didn't exist. I was going to do it slowly and strategically and with the same patience that had kept my identity safe for 7 years. And this time I wouldn't be doing it alone.
If you loved this video, show me some support by subscribing and clicking the notification bell.